Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Lassar. Nice to see you all here. And thanks for this opportunity to say something about my friend and former student, Joe Gabent. Joe, sorry about that, wrote a wonderful term paper for my exit seminar in the academic year 2007-2008, and that was 10 years ago, and a different planet, it feels like. Back then, I had my students focus their term paper project on a major 20th century cultural figure. It could be anybody, W.E.B. Du Bois, Betty Friedan. One of my students wrote a paper about the historian Linda Gordon. Joe picked Edward Bernays, nephew to Sigmund Freud, often heralded as the father of public relations. But over the course of the seminar, Joe came to me with a problem. One of my directions to students for the term paper was to identify ways that their historical subject had changed over time. Joe confessed to me that he couldn't find any evidence of Bernays' thinking changing very much or evolving very much. I asked him why he thought that, and by the end of our conversation, I saw that he had a case. Joe's paper argued that Bernays was too wrapped up in himself, in his personal persona as patriarch of public relations, to publicly alter his thinking. Although he sometimes broke his own rules in the course of a public relations campaign, he never admitted to doing so. He became so invested in his own image that he feared to grow or evolve intellectually during his remarkably long career. He died at the age of 104. Prospering in a steadily expanding American economy, being Edward Bernays was just too profitable for him to change his ideas. Lastly, Joe argued, and I quote, his familial connection with Sigmund Freud infused Bernays with a sense of duty to carry on what he saw as the logical extension of Freud's theories of the unconscious. Joe's paper concluded with the following: we live in a society today where morality and ideals are commodities available for purchase and marketed by forms of propaganda that Bernays helped develop. This might be the most disturbing aspect of his story, that we may actually be as submissive and susceptible to group influence as he claims us to be. Here we are, 10 years later, grappling with this observation in our time in ways that we could not have imagined a decade ago. I will say no more about our fate to live through these interesting times, but I feel lucky to have students like Joe, who we ostensibly teach, and who teach us so much more in return. Please welcome our student and colleague. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that happy and uplifting end to my paper, thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for being here. As Professor Lassar said, my name is Joe Gabent, and I teach elementary school. I teach 4th and 5th grade. How fun is that? I get to spend my days with small humans who have been alive long enough to understand my jokes and sarcasm, but hopefully not long enough to get too discouraged when things don't go the way they think they should go, or overly jaded and influenced by their peers, because they'll have plenty of time for that in middle school. Teaching is definitely something I'd call a passion, and I think it's hard to be a teacher without it. Not that you can't perform the functions of a teacher, but enthusiasm is definitely contagious when it comes to learning at any age. And without the excitement for learning, it's awfully difficult to encourage and shape students to become lifelong learners. Although the responsibilities at times seem immense, and the lack of time, always the lack of time to do everything you want and need to do, can be frustrating, these are highly outweighed by so many things. The connections you make with your students who are excited about life and learning and are eager to show what they know and ask questions when they don't. Seeing the academic, social, and emotional growth of students as they discover what they themselves are passionate about and how that in turn affects the people they want to become or really are becoming. Witnessing that light bulb moment when a student says, "Oh, I get it." I love that moment. Also making connections with the families of my students, being able to communicate what we do in the classroom and find ways to connect it to home. So this is my 9th year teaching, which means it's been over a decade since I was here as an undergrad. And before you comment on how old I look for someone in their early 30s, which is how old someone would normally be 10 years out of college, I will tell you that I actually was in my early 30s as an undergrad, so you can do the math on how old I am. I did initially go to UCSC right out of high school for a couple years, ended up leaving mainly due to financial reasons. Took me a decade to get back, and during that time I worked for Orchard Supply Hardware, first as an assistant store manager, a district human resources manager, finally a training specialist, which was, I can now say, a bit of a bridge to becoming a teacher, since training and teaching share a lot of DNA. In my case, training was something I did with adults, and teaching is something I do with children. And in case you're wondering, yes, I found that teaching kids and adults share a lot of common strategies. Make it interesting, fun, relevant, let everybody's voice be heard, manage discipline problems, listen to excuses for why something wasn't finished on time, provide snacks, maybe nap time if possible. So after returning to UCSC in 2006, I had already completed all my general ed requirements and was able to focus strictly on earning my history degree with a minor in education, then went directly into UCSC's MAT program to earn my master's degree in education and my teaching credential. As an undergraduate, I focused primarily on modern United States history, in particular on how the ideas that would eventually become the foundation of modern American culture and political life were shaped and reshaped over the last century. I was, and still am, interested in things like consumer behavior, group thought, propaganda, mass persuasion, and how the strategies of the public relations field change the way people think about themselves in order to market things to them, such as products, politicians, ideas, and so on. For my senior thesis, which Professor Lazar talked about, which also was the focus of my presentation in 2008 at that year's History Showcase, I tried to tell the story of L Bernays, which again, Professor Lazar mentioned. And he wrote one of his most famous books, unsubtly titled Propaganda, and it was more like a how-to book than an analysis of it. And I do want to quote myself from the beginning of my paper because I think it actually sets the stage in an interesting way to talk about teaching and education. Edward L. Bernays considers himself to be the father of the field of public relations, and history seems to agree with him. He pioneered many techniques that would revolutionize the way corporations manipulate the public to sell their products. Nephew to Sigmund Freud, he drew on his uncle's ideas about the unconscious mind to demonstrate how people's deepest desires could be tapped into and exploited for one's own ends. Bernays believed this to be necessary in a democracy where the masses often behaved in a dangerous and irrational manner, subject to a herd mentality with the potential to challenge the dominant power dynamic in society. He deemed it far too hazardous to allow ordinary people control over their own lives, and believed consumerism was a way of giving them the illusion of control while allowing a responsible elite to continue managing society through what he called a hidden government. Although he was not necessarily the originator of these ideas, the herd instinct, the psychology of the unconscious, and deep emotional manipulation, Bernays was one of the first to attempt to use them to influence public opinion and behavior in a time of peace for purely economic interest, in service of large corporations. His persuasion campaigns linked products and ideas to unconscious desires, encouraging people to purchase items they did not actually require. Since this would serve to satisfy their inner selfish needs, transforming them, as Herbert Hoover sardonically noted upon taking office in 1929, into docile happiness machines. Bernays believed democracy itself would be ultimately strengthened. Which all sounds pretty creepy to me and pretty prescient. And also something tells me, I'm not sure where Jason is, but something tells me that Franco and Bernays were probably aware of each other, maybe fans of each other as well. So one of the reasons that all of this interests me, I like to believe, had to do with my aversion to being marketed to or manipulated into doing something against my interests. Also, I've always been fascinated by how strategies meant to change minds and beliefs and ultimately actions are at the heart of the human experience, whether on a small scale like, buy this toothpaste, or on a large scale like, support a war against this country or a group of people. These strategies can change the way others think in either a positive or negative way, which itself is a matter of judgment, of course. And I have to admit, until I started planning this event today, I don't know that I consciously saw a connection between this and teaching, which is, in fact, let's face it, an attempt to change how a group of people think about the world around them. In my case, it happens to be a group of 32 10-year-olds, which is a pretty malleable group of people, if you think about it. So in the months leading up to today, I've been asking myself certain questions. What does history have to do with teaching and education? How does my interest in these things connect to my desire to teach? What one person calls teaching, would someone else call propaganda or indoctrination? And I can't say I know the answers to these questions, and I also don't claim that they are new questions. But I certainly see some of this playing out in things like the rise of homeschooling, charter schools, and other schools of choice. And it seems to me that people make these choices for their children, among many reasons, I'm sure, because they're not fully behind what or how their child is being taught, and would like to have more control over the information, ideas, and worldview being given to their child. But I suppose my point here is more personal, wondering how my own biases, which I certainly have, just like anyone else, shape how I teach, how I interact with my students, and the kind of academic skills I believe they need to be successful and fulfilled. So now that all the personal history is out of the way, I'd like to talk about how my experiences here in the history department gave me the skills and mindset necessary to become what I hope is a successful educator. In other words, why do historians make good teachers? How do they apply the skills of a historian to help others gain knowledge and abilities and experiences and opinions? And most importantly, to be excited and enthusiastic and confident about what they're learning, to persevere when they find things challenging, and hopefully want to keep doing all this for the rest of their lives, and again, to become lifelong learners. And this is really at the heart of what I want to talk about here. So my central claim that I want to make here is teacher equals student. If you really love being a student, if you love learning something new every day, becoming a teacher is one of the best ways to achieve this. I would argue that in order to be a truly effective teacher, not to mention a teacher that maintains the level of enthusiasm and excitement needed to, 1, avoid burnout, 2, transfer that same enthusiasm for learning to your students, and 3, continue to evolve your practice, you need to also be a lifelong learner. This is easily one of the things I love most about being a teacher, that I also get to continue being a student. This plays out in the way I design lessons, recognize students' growth and areas of need, and how I manage my classroom and build community throughout the year. And here also, most definitely, is where the skills of a historian come into practice. For instance, I use research to learn about and implement teaching practices. I use writing to reflect upon my teaching practice and communicate with parents, colleagues, and other educational professionals, I use data analysis to assess student learning and adjust my teaching strategies accordingly. I use critical thinking to plan meaningful lessons and projects that are age appropriate and connected to educational standards, hopefully fun and engaging as well. As far as passing all of these things on to my students, I want to share some examples from my classroom. So a historian can teach how to investigate and research a topic or problem. This is a skill that I teach I teach this skill during lessons about writing informative research papers and how to back up their opinions with evidence during debates. When they're able to dig deep into a topic they're highly interested in, they see how this process can deepen their connection to and knowledge of this topic. Related to this is just the importance of careful and critical reading. Showing kids, for instance, how to read a multiple part math problem and actually do all parts, not just the last part that they just read. This is one of my teacher pet peeves. A historian can teach students how to analyze and interpret information. I teach the skill when doing scientific inquiries and investigations, math story problems with hidden steps, and when identifying the theme of a book they are reading, including clear evidence and examples that show the theme. A historian can teach students how to think critically. I teach critical thinking by asking open-ended questions during science talk about particular phenomenon, or when encouraging groups of students working on a project to discuss why they made a certain decision, or better yet, if they decided to do something, what would the likely outcomes be? A historian can teach students strategies for good communication. And this skill is woven into pretty much everything I do, both academic and social. This helps students learn how to work together collaboratively on group projects, which we do all the time in my class, which is not something I really remember doing a lot in 5th grade. So I think that's been a huge change in the last 30 years. This mirrors the type of real-world projects that they will be expected to do both in school and in their careers. And on the social side of things, they also need to be able to share their feelings in a constructive way, to get their opinions across, to disagree respectfully, to assume positive intentions rather than place blame, and so many things that will help them avoid arguments, hurt feelings, and confrontations, which they will no doubt still have at some point. So in the MAT program, we read a book called Planning for Inquiry by Diane Parker that really had a big impact on my teaching. It was all about the idea of inquiry-based learning. And I found an interesting quote that said, quote, "One of the keys to fostering an inquiry-based curriculum is learning to recognize questions that are generative, that offer possibilities for extended investigations and broader connections," end quote. And this is a skill that all teachers have, or should have, one that will allow flexibility as well as more personalized instruction for their students. And in order to make inquiries meaningful to students, teachers need to ensure that a number of things occur. That kids are highly involved in the decision-making process, that the inquiry connects multiple disciplines and subjects. Sometimes the class works together as a whole, sometimes in small groups, sometimes kids are working on their own. The whole process should be democratic, and students should always be aware that they have an audience. It could be just their classmates, could be other classes, could be parents or other invited guests that you bring in to hear and see their product, depending on what the project is. So they need to have a professional final product. The author advises teachers to be aware that, quote, "authentic inquiries can't help but lead to others," end quote. So be prepared to cycle back around and continue with the process indefinitely. And at the time I didn't know it, but this approach would prove to be pretty tried and true for me, especially once my school began following a project-based learning approach with a lot more gusto. And what is described above are some of the most essential elements of PBL, according to an organization called the Buck Institute, which is an organization that my school has been partnered with. It helps train and develop our teachers in project-based learning. And according to them, these are the key indicators of what they call a gold standard PBL project. And it's a lot, I realize it's very similar to the stuff that I read in that Planning for Inquiry book. Projects should have key knowledge, understanding, and success skills, a challenging problem or question that they're trying to investigate, sustained inquiry, authenticity, student voice and choice, reflection on the whole process that they're going through, critique and revision, and some sort of a public product. Now, to get into some of the specifics, one type of approach that I think encompasses a lot of the skills I've been talking about here has to do with science and engineering. Teaching engineering in particular, and more specifically, engineering design challenge learning, is somewhat new for me personally, at least over the last few, 3 to 5 years perhaps. And it's only been with the implementing of the new Next Generation Science Standards, NGSS, which my school district has been implementing slowly over the last few years, that I've gained more understanding and interest in the engineering design process, which I introduced to my students gradually over the course of the year. The engineering design process is perfect for getting kids to use a lot of the skills that we've been talking about. That I've been talking about. Investigation and research, analyzing and interpreting data, communication and collaboration, critical thinking, and so on. And this graphic kind of shows the engineering design process. One of the things I love about this is it shows that the process is a continuing cycle. So there's not really any specific endpoint. It's all about identifying a problem, coming up with ideas to fix the problem, trying some possible solutions and gathering data, making new iterations based on that data, and so on. And I heard a great acronym a few years back. I don't even remember where, so I can't give the credit to whoever I heard it from. But I introduce it on the first day of school every year. So we talk about what an engineer does, and we talk about that an engineer will fail. But that's just their first attempt in learning. And I tell them all on the first day, I expect you all to fail this year. And so we talk about, I try to reinforce that idea that failure usually has a negative connotation, but if we remember that things often don't work out the way we originally intended, we understand that each time we try something, We learn new things, which we can use to make whatever that thing is better and better. I try to get my students to apply this, not only to design challenges, but also pieces of writing, art projects, a new math concept that they're learning, making a presentation in front of class, dribbling a basketball, just about anything. So since this is a history showcase, it would seem like a missed opportunity if I didn't at least talk a little bit about the kinds of experiences that I try to allow my students to have when studying history. One of the big ideas I try to weave into a lot of things, and I heard this word from some of our earlier presenters, is that in order to understand why things are the way they are now, we must understand the context in which they sit and the events and ideas that came before. And we can do this by not just looking at historical events from our own perspective, but from the perspective of those living that history. And that's a pretty big concept for a 10-year-old to wrap their head around. But I really love trying to get them to wrap their head around it. So I'd like to share a few quick examples. So first, the American Revolution. So by portraying a particular historical figure becoming an expert on important laws and events that led to the revolution, and enacting famous battles, students learn the political, religious, and economic reasons that led to the Revolutionary War. We were stationed on Angel Island in the Civil War for 3 years, not really, just overnight, but the simulation lasted 3 years long. Students learned about what it was like to serve as part of the Union Army, including marching drills, orienteering, KP duty, cooking in the bakehouse, and most importantly, how we as an Army company worked as a team towards a common goal. The Gold Rush. We did a lot of stuff around the Gold Rush, and especially in 4th grade. There's a strong focus on California history in 4th grade. Here, students participated in a simulation as gold seekers during the Gold Rush, allowing them to experience the excitement, the hardships, and the challenges of this time. The simulation had classroom elements, as well as off-site visits to the Balcalutha, which is where we are here. It's a Gold Rush-era ship in San Francisco, as well as a tent town in the gold country of California, where they got to experience commerce, pan for gold, all sorts of fun stuff. Pioneer simulation. So here students, I had to tell them no smiles. Like they didn't smile back then. And of course we talked about why that was. And some of them have some really mean mugs on. I love it. By simulating what it was like to travel across the country in a covered wagon during the time of westward expansion in the mid-1800s, making decisions and working as a team along the way, students take the perspective of a historical character in order to experience some of the same hardships as those original pioneers. And not all of them made it to Oregon, unfortunately. Another project that I just called California Immigration was connected to California history, more specifically to the Gold Rush, but it extended into the present. And basically it was all about why California is such a diverse state and how it started back in the Gold Rush as immigrants from all over the world came to California hoping to strike it rich. And what students did is they told the story of a particular immigrant group from their perspective, perspective of that group, starting at the Gold Rush and extending into the modern day. And they focused on how that particular group, how they've grown, how they've contributed to California's politics, culture, and economy. They did this through research, through interviews, working with digital storytelling tools. And ultimately, we connected the project to our school's annual international festival, where student groups volunteered at the booths, and they shared their projects with visitors to the festival. Interestingly, this project happened a couple months after the last presidential election. So immigration was a pretty heavy topic. Obviously, it still is. But to be able to get students to understand the value of immigrants in our state and to see what they've contributed was pretty fascinating, pretty amazing. So other roles, aside from the skills of a historian to teach and attempting to pass on those same skills to your students, there are also all sorts of things that you have to do as a teacher that are not teaching. So, but being a history major really does help prepare you for. So you need to be able to communicate, to build trusting and collaborative relationships with parents. You need to collaborate with other teachers, for instance, those at the same grade level with whom you often plan. There's also a big component of mentoring in education, becoming a teacher leader, which most school districts are looking for. So not just someone who's good with students, but also someone who's good with adults. You do things like develop and lead professional development for other teachers. You make presentations to the school board. You train and develop student teachers. You fundraise for supplies, trips, events, so you have to be able to persuade others that what you're doing is important and worthwhile. You analyze assessment data and use it to inform your teaching. You sit on district leadership committees and help plan the direction of different subject areas for the district. You might sit on school committees, parent boards, you might be a representative for your teacher union, and always looking for ways to grow your practice with continued professional development. And this is why being a student really does never end. Just for fun, I try to think about a bunch of other roles and jobs I have as a teacher that are not necessarily in the job description, because there are a lot. Instructional specialist. I think that's in the job description. Mentor, coach, life coach, counselor, artist, hygienist, IT specialist, librarian, nurse, accountant, public speaker, administrator, disciplinarian, child psychologist, adult psychologist. I doubt it's surprising to hear that as a teacher I've dealt with too many crying children to count, but I've also dealt with crying adults. Adults who, of course, love their children, they want the best for them, and understandably become emotional when their child is struggling or succeeding. And as stressful as it might be to have these difficult conversations, I'm also extremely honored and humbled that parents trust me enough to confide some very personal things in me. I really do see us as part of a team working together for a common goal. My all-time favorite example of this is Team Trixie. A little bit more about Team Trixie. Trixie was a student of mine about maybe 6 years ago, and Team Trixie was made up of Trixie's mother, father, and their significant others. They all lived in the same apartment complex, and they were all totally dedicated to Trixie. Whenever there was any communication that happened with us, whenever any of them sent an email to me, they copied everybody else on it, and they just signed it Team Trixie. And I just loved the way that they all worked together with me, and they let me be part of that team. The last role that I'll talk about is being a diplomat. So often you have to help people reach peace agreements. I mentioned crying adults earlier. I have to sometimes deal with yelling adults, angry at the way their child is graded, or perhaps how their child was treated by another child, which can potentially set up a situation where you end up playing referee between two adults yelling at each other. The first time this happened, I remember thinking this was not part of any class that I took. But I learned pretty quickly that diffusing this kind of situation with adults is not really much different than diffusing a disagreement between children. Try to bring down the level of anger, or wait till both sides have calmed down enough to have a more productive conversation. Make sure both sides feel that they've been heard. Try to agree on some basic facts. Try to get them to distinguish between someone's intentions and how those intentions were perceived, and to uncover any assumptions that were made. So to wrap up, I just want to say that teaching is not easy, but it is immensely fun and rewarding. And I really value my experiences here at the UC Santa Cruz History Department. I know I wouldn't be the teacher I am today without it. And I know that today's history undergraduates will begin their careers with the same preparation and potential for success that I did. Thank you.
This isn't a question, but I just want to say...
Is it a complaint?
No, not at all, not at all. In South Africa, there is a saying that is often translated from a word, Ubuntu, and it's usually paraphrased by saying a person is a person through other people. A teacher is a teacher through other teachers. And I want to thank you for modeling that.
Thank you.
You all learned everything you need to know from John?
We could talk about the order of operations, multiplication. We could add and subtract some mixed numbers if you want.
I was just wondering if you'd ever considered teaching adults and why you chose to be an elementary school teacher and not a middle school or high school or college professor.
That's a good question. Thank you. I mean, I did back before I was a teacher, and I worked for Orchard Supply Hardware. I did, I was a training specialist, so I did a lot of management training, so sort of helping new managers be managers in a retail environment. Also organizing product training events where I'd get a bunch of like power tool vendors to come in, and everybody would get to play with the tools, and then they would be able to go back and sell them at the stores. And I mean, I think I've always wanted to be a teacher for kids. Back when I was in high school, I did a lot of work with young kids in summer programs. Being a camp counselor up at science camp, that kind of thing. I almost feel like, and I mentioned also that there are a lot of similarities between teaching adults and teaching kids. I think I get along really well, especially with this age group. I have taught younger grades before. Like when I was a student teacher, I student taught in a second grade class. But you can't really joke around with a second grader. You can't really like be sarcastic, and have little inside jokes and stuff. They just kind of go, huh? So that's one of the things I love is making those connections. Middle school, we all remember our middle school experiences, and that's a tough age. That's a tough age. I have considered and still consider possibly at some point, teaching high school or college. I have only been teaching for 9 years, which seems like a long time, but in a lot of sense it doesn't. I feel like I want to become an expert at what I'm doing. Well, actually, that seems to go counter to what I was talking about earlier. Maybe you're never an expert. You're always learning. I would find it fascinating to be able to teach different subjects at different age levels as well. Like, again, I love teaching history, and to be able to teach history at a high school or a college level, I think that would be really amazing and fun.
Hi, thank you so much. When you are teaching history, how do you kind of navigate between like the curriculum and like dominant discourse about history versus like revisionist histories and what you would want to teach? Like especially I'm thinking about the 4th grade mission project specifically. Just because you said you're a 4th grade teacher, I'm going to call you out.
No, we do a PBL project about the missions where the students basically decide where they would put the next mission if there was one, and they sort of pretend that they are designing this mission, and they make their presentation to the Archbishop of Spain, which is usually somebody that we have come in dressed as the Archbishop, and the kids all wear their nice clothes, and they make their presentations. A lot of the research comes initially from them. Most PBL projects are the ideas are supposed to come from the kids, or at least the direction that they want to take it. But of course, within the structure of a PBL project, the teacher also gets to, kind of nudge them in certain ways. So part of this project is that they have to create a persuasive brochure that they're going to give to the Archbishop to say, why you should build a mission in this particular part of the state. And in a lot of cases, they do reference the fact that, there will be Native Americans that can live and work on your mission. And so that, in that sense, for that project, I definitely use that as a jumping off point for, talking about, do you think they wanted to live there? Do you think there were any benefits of living there? What were the drawbacks? And so we kind of branched that out into a much larger conversation. But I do try as much as possible to not just preach at them. I do want them to come to that understanding themselves wherever possible.
So this is super exciting to me because in the future I also want to be a 4th and 5th grade teacher.
Yes.
So yay! And I have a lot of relatives in my family who are also teaching elementary school, and I would always try and squeeze them for advice, and they all say the same thing, that there's a lot of incredible moments, but there's also quite a few hard and difficult ones as well. So I was wondering, what do you use to strategize getting through those harder moments?
Like practically getting the kids through that moment, or just emotionally myself, or yoga, some stretching. I mean, it's tough. I mean, even just yesterday, I had a situation where I was told that one of my students made a racially insensitive comment about some people that were at our school doing some work, and so that's not an easy conversation to have with a kid, and especially when parents get involved as well, and so I find myself having to navigate these pretty tough conversations with parents and adults, and not wanting to place, parents sometimes want to place blame on, say, another child, like he's a racist, or he said this, so he's a bad kid, and trying to get parents to understand that no one's a bad kid. They maybe made a bad choice. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question properly, but I mean, those kind of incidents are pretty common, not just the racially involved ones, but just anything that has a lot of emotion and deep feeling. And I think one of the things I fall back on a lot is just the idea that I spend weeks and months, and in a lot of cases years. Like at my school, I loop with my kids, so I have them for 4th grade and then I have them for 5th grade again. And so I get to know them and the families over a pretty big swath of time. And so one of the things that I fall back on a lot is just remembering that connection that I have with the kids and with the families, and try to understand that we all want the best for their kid, again, kind of coming back to that teamwork idea, and just, realizing that I'm a member of the team, and, sometimes team players might, need a little help or make a mistake, but we work together to hopefully solve it.